when Moses came to the burning bush, he asked the question. He said, "How is it that the bush is not consumed with fire?" And when he came back from bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt, and God asked him to bring 70 of the elders of Israel up on Mount Sinai, Moses asked a question that was similar. He said, how can we bring them up on the mountain without them being consumed? God had said, that no one was to touch the mountain, and they put a boundary round about the mountain. And God said, no, go ahead and bring them up. And the 70 elders went up on the mountain, and it says they ate and drank before God, and upon the nobles of Israel God laid not his hand. And it says they saw God. Then later, when Israel went into Canaan, God described himself as working through Israel to consume the Canaanites. And he points out that it was really, God that would be doing this, through them. So I believe we can think of the period from the time Moses was at the burning bush until David defeated the Canaanites. It says he placed all enemies under his feet. That whole period, God would be seen as a consuming fire, and it would not end until David's sacrifice was made after he brought all of his enemies under his feet, and that sacrifice was accepted by God. That God would not be seen as a consuming fire any longer after that period. So the Canaanites, to them, God was a consuming fire, just as it was to Israel. There's one passage where David is speaking, where he defeats, I believe it was the Philistines in a battle, and he said, God hath broken forth upon mine enemies like the flood of waters. So all during that period, I think we can think of Israel as that consuming fire that was on Mount Sinai was now dwelling in the midst of Israel in the tabernacle. And they carried the tabernacle. They would carry the Ark of the Covenant into battle. And so that consuming fire, Israel was that consuming fire. God was dwelling in their midst, and he was now consuming the Canaanites through Israel. And once that period ended, that's when David's sacrifice was accepted at Mount Moriah. That was after the 3 days of pestilence. That God, once the temple, there was the period of peace after David's sacrifice was accepted, which led to Solomon's reign of peace, where the temple was built. And once that period of God appearing as fire ended, things changed. And what the change was is that both Israel and God had entered into rest. So, and what that would mean is that God's law has found a place to rest in the hearts of his people, and God had found a place to rest in the midst of his people, and that place in the story was Solomon's temple. So now you'll recall that there were statements made to Moses that they were not to have anything to do with the Canaanites. They were not to intermarry with them, or not only the Canaanites, but any nations, any other nations outside them. Even before they came to Canaan, they were confronted with various nations, and they were to stay away from them. They were not to, their daughters, they were not to allow to marry them and make no covenants with them. So, but once Solomon's reign started, and once the temple was dedicated, Solomon was inviting nations, surrounding nations, to come and see the temple. So I think if we think of the period when Israel was from Mount Sinai to Mount Zion, the period when God was appearing as a fire, that was the period when Israel was carrying the tabernacle. The sanctuary was portable. But the period of the temple, that represents Christ in glory. So the period when the Ark of the Covenant is covered with animal skins, that represents the period of the sufferings of Christ. So all from the time of when Moses first saw the burning bush, until the time David's sacrifice was accepted by fire, that is the period when represents the period of the sufferings of Christ. It represents the period when God is seen as a consuming fire, and once that both Israel and God had entered their rest, and that would be signified by the God filling the glory, his glory filling the temple at its dedication. That would be the period now, is when God will no longer appear as a consuming fire. Israel has safely entered God's rest, and so that would then signify the period when I believe I would equate that to the period of when the river of water of life starts proceeding out from under the temple to the nations. And you'll recall that the fame of Solomon went out to the nations, and they were coming to Jerusalem, and he was welcoming them. Solomon was welcoming them to Jerusalem, and so it was a different period. Whereas prior to the dedication of the temple, I believe it would have been wrong for David to be welcoming, prior to the temple, welcoming the Gentiles to come and see the Jerusalem, because it was still in the period of warfare. It was still in the period when God was a consuming fire. So I guess that's it.